That was the very first bill I introduced in my entire legislative career. It was AB 528, and it was to end BART strikes, to end them in a way that I think is fair to workers, BART workers, but also fair to BART riders. This is a bill that said, well, it really addressed the ways in which we found ourselves confronted with BART strikes, and that was this. The contract for BART workers expires, and the BART workers have a no-strike clause. They have a promise in their contract not to strike. But if the contract expires, they said we're not bound by that contract anymore. We can strike. The problem is they continued to be paid after the contract expired. They continued to get all their benefits. And so my bill said, hey, BART workers, if you have a no-strike clause and the contract expires and you're still getting paid under the contract, you have to honor the no-strike clause. You don't get to pick some provisions of it that you like and others you don't. You have to be fair. And that would mean that they don't strike. So it basically held BART to their promise not to do strikes, even when their contract expired, because we were paying them anyway. And I think if you're getting paid by the BART system, you should not be able to strike. And that's what my bill said.
How's the progress of that?
Well, we had some very good progress with the bill. We were told that it would never get a hearing, and it did. We were told it would die, and it didn't. It lasted for a whole year where I was able to educate colleagues. It has died on a party line vote. I'm actually the only candidate in my race who believes in ending BART strikes and passing legislation to make sure they will never be a threat to our community again. My opponent does not agree with doing that, and that's a very sharp difference between the two of us, and I'm going to keep working on ending BART strikes. It's important.
Because a lot of BART riders were really angry about the cause of all the problems, and you are the only one to stand out.
Was the only legislator in the entire Bay Area to introduce legislation to bring a fair end to BART strikes. And again, I'm the only one in this existing campaign who believes that they should be ended. BART should not be allowed to strike. And there's so many challenges that BART is facing. I think we need to focus on those rather than continuing to allow workers to strike and keep our system from operating. You know, 500,000 people, almost 500,000 people rely on BART every day to get to work. And I think it is just wrong to put everybody hostage in the Bay Area through a strike.
How do you feel when you stand alone?
When I stand alone on those issues? I feel just fine, because I know that in my community, regardless of what political party people might be a member of, they agree. They don't see this, people who live in this community don't see this as a partisan issue. They see this as a fairness and common sense issue. And I don't mind sometimes if I'm the only one leading the way. Somebody's got to lead the way first, and that's part of what I'm doing.
Nowadays, people see a lot of political correctness.
Yeah.
And some people think, well, this is strike, it's a union issue.
Yeah.
How do you think of, how are you generally looking at this kind of thing? It's too much now.
Well, it really isn't an anti-union position. I do believe that unions are part of our First Amendment right. Free speech is one of the most fundamental principles we have in America. It's something that all of us have as a right, but I don't believe the right to strike when you affect not only public safety, but our health and the ability of people to get to jobs and have a livelihood and get to the hospital, get to their doctor's appointment, get to school. That's something that when you're that critical, as BART is, to mobility in the Bay Area, you should not be allowed to strike. Just like police and firefighters are not allowed to strike. They're too essential to our ability to live in the Bay Area, and I think that's a very different distinction. So I don't really see this as something that's anti-union, particularly because at least my legislation only is in effect if the unions have agreed not to strike. Remember, it's their contract that they say, I will not strike. What happens is they let the contract expire. And I'm just saying, once that happens, you have to keep abiding by your promise as long as you still get paid. To me, that's a fairness issue.
That's interesting.
Yeah. It's a very creative way to try to deal, I think, with the solution of BART strikes. And instead of just banning them, which I think is perfectly legitimate, you try to work with both sides in a way that's fair. And this is fair because it says if you've promised not to strike and you keep getting paid, you shouldn't be allowed to strike. You have to hold up to your promise. And that's what I believe in.